400 kilometers traveling around Western Cape, visiting many of you that have received on your farms. So it was very interesting for me to see this part and to have the opportunity to discuss with many of you about the problems and the successes that you have on your farm. Analyzing what I have seen, I think that there are some problems, and ryegrass seems to me to be the biggest problem of most farmers. So ryegrass is something that to take into consideration in this part of the world, but we have seen many examples also how people get rid of the problem. One of them seems to be to keep the livestock out of the paddocks and go for maximum soil cover on the fields, and not let the hoofs tickling the ground where they may cause compaction and also may cause the ryegrass to germinate. Many farmers also complained or observed that carbon sequestration is too low because of prevailing climate. The question is it climate or is it management? And an often heard observation was, we cannot produce enough residues. Why can't you produce enough residues? And my impression is that as long as you keep sheep in the cropping fields, you're not going to be able to produce enough residues. And also this situation that we discussed it yesterday, that I only keep very few sheep, only for a few days. How many days? 30 days. That's not a few days, it's many days. And in my opinion, to make a difference, you have to keep the sheep completely out of the cropping fields. This is a separate operation. Sheep are in this part of the farm, and cropping is on the other side of the farm. And the moment you allow them to be for a couple of days, a week or two, then suddenly you discover that the price of meat is good, and then you decide, no, we're going to keep 1 or 2 or 3 weeks longer, because then we'll transform this immediately into meat. But what happens to your soil? Have you thought about that? And I think that I showed you very clearly with my slides that taking the residues away, be it through baling them and selling them, or taking them away by burning, or eating the residues by cattle or by sheep, then you, of course, never are going to achieve high amounts of residues. There is a general feeling that sheep are needed to reduce risk. Fortunately, the last presentation you heard just now told you that you can reduce also risk when you improve the soil quality. If you invest in your soil, keep the residues, full residue retention, no export of residue, then you increase the organic matter content of the soil, you increase carbon, and you increase your production and productivity. So this is something that caught my attention. Tine cedars prevail in the Western Cape, And there's a feeling that these cedars do not work on stony soil conditions. From what we saw on our excursion, and I showed you one picture, that seeding into a heavy stone situation is possible with modern cedars. They are designed to work also under these conditions. So this doesn't seem to be a limitation for these cedars. You can use them also on stony soils. And I've seen that also happen in Spain. There are farmers doing no-tillage around the Córdoba area, and these farmers have these round river stone bed stones, and you don't see the soil because there's so many stones they have on their ground, and still they're using these cedars and coping with that situation. So there are other examples where that happens and where that works too. And one observation I would like to make is that under a rigorous application of FAO's definition of conservation agriculture, most farmers in the Western Cape do not apply conservation agriculture. If you go into the homepage of FAO and look for what are the requisites for being considered conservation agriculture, soil cover is the most important factor, and you need to have more than 30% soil cover after seeding. So when you have passed with your seeder, you measure the percentage of soil cover. If you have more than 30%, it applies or classifies as conservation agriculture. And from what we saw on the fields, and also from some pictures, is that many times, or perhaps in most situations, once the tine seeder has passed through the ground and seeded the crop, then you have perhaps 10, 15, 20%, but seldom more than 30% cover on the soil. If I'm wrong on this, please correct me. 3 days of assessment of the situation in Western Cape is way too short, but we can discuss this in a minute when we have the opportunity to discuss. So, to wrap it up in a few sentences, it's my opinion that you would improve substantially your no-tillage system with full stubble retention, no sheep in the cropping area. I'm not saying that you should sell the sheep or not work with sheep, but it has to be a separate operation. You have them on the meadows, on the lupins, on the pasture crops, but you do not let them take the residues away. So an integration of sheep, of animal and crop production may in some cases be positive, in many cases it is. They do this a lot in Brazil, integration of cattle production, meat production and agriculture in such a way that you use 3 years or 4 or 5 years for meat production, and then you turn over to crop production. So it is a continuous change, and this works very well under Brazilian conditions. And the next thing, to retain more residues on the soil surface, is of course using disc seeders. I did not gut the last presentation was, he said he tried disc seeders and compared with tines. What was his conclusion? Johannes? What was Johannes' conclusion? Was the tine cedar better or this cedar?
The establishment with the time was better than the disc.
The establishment of the time was better than this. Of course, this is one experience, and for instance, the results I showed you from Frank Dijkstra, where the yield of corn went from 4,000 to 8,000 kilos in 20 years, and soybeans went from 2,000 to 3,600 kilos per hectare in 20 years. This is the farm of Frank Dijkstra, a Dutch farmer that emigrated to Brazil, and he is farming on very sandy soil, 80% sand, perhaps not as sandy as some of your soils over here, but enough to call it a real sandy soil. And he is doing it since 1976. That means that in a few years he will complete 40 years of continuous no-till in a very sandy soil. So, and he has been using this since he is working on that farm in no-tillage, because tines, as I told you already, are very seldomly used in South America. So with this is the summary that I wanted to make, and I think we can invite the group for the discussion.
Yeah, discussions.
Question and answer.